Hey, welcome back. Grab something warm to drink and get comfortable, because tonight I've got 3 stories for you, and each one goes to a completely different place. One will make you cheer, one will make the hair on your arms stand up, and the last one honestly stuck with me for days. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's get into it. For 3 months, my new neighbor parked his truck across my driveway every single morning, and he thought there was nothing I could do about it. His name was Craig, and Craig had decided that the strip of curb in front of my house was somehow his by divine right, even though he had a 2-car garage and a driveway wide enough to land a small plane. He just liked the shade from my maple tree. That was the reason he gave me actually, the one time I knocked on his door and asked him politely to stop. He looked at me over his coffee and said, quote, "The street is public property, buddy," and then he shut the door in my face. So it stopped being about the parking. Here's the thing Craig didn't know about me. I work for the city, not in some glamorous role. I'm a records and compliance clerk, which means I spend my days buried in ordinances, permits, and the kind of municipal fine print that makes normal people's eyes glaze over. And I knew, because it was literally my job to know, that our town had passed an ordinance the year before requiring any vehicle over a certain weight, which included Craig's enormous lifted truck, to display a valid residential heavy vehicle permit if parked on a public street overnight. Nobody enforced it. Nobody even knew about it. But I did, so I started documenting. Every morning before work, I took a time-stamped photo of Craig's truck blocking my driveway. I noted the date, the duration, the license plate. I did this for 2 weeks, calmly, like a man watering his plants. Craig would sometimes wave at me while I did it, thinking I was just some sad little guy taking pictures of my own misery. Then I filed. Not a complaint exactly. I filed a formal request to have the ordinance enforced on my street, and because I knew the process better than anyone, I attached my photographs, the vehicle weight specifications pulled straight from the manufacturer, and citations to the exact code sections. I sent it to the parking enforcement supervisor, who happened to eat lunch 2 desks away from me, and I said, very sincerely, I just want to make sure we're applying the law consistently. The first ticket appeared on Craig's windshield on a Tuesday. $50. He tore it off and threw it in the gutter, which I also photographed. The second ticket came Wednesday. By Friday, he had $300 in fines and a very confused look on his face, because as far as he could tell, the universe had simply decided to start hating him. He came pounding on my door that Saturday, waving the tickets, demanding to know if I had something to do with it. And this was the best part. I told him the truth. I said, Craig, I don't write the tickets. I don't decide who gets them. I just ask the city to enforce a law that already exists. If you'd like, I can print you a copy of the ordinance. It's public property, buddy. His face went through about 4 different colors. He tried to fight the tickets. He couldn't because they were airtight, filed by someone who does this for a living. Within a month, the fines were pushing $800, and the truck moved into his driveway, where it has stayed ever since, gathering exactly 0 shade from my maple tree. But the payoff I never saw coming happened later. A few other neighbors, it turned out, had been fighting their own quiet wars with Craig over his leaf blower at 6 in the morning, over his dog, over the trailer he'd left rotting on the shared alley. Once word got around that the ordinances actually could be enforced, and that the quiet guy at the end of the street knew how, my doorbell started ringing. I've since helped 4 households, all perfectly legally, all by the book. Craig waves at me a lot less these days. And every morning, when I back out of my completely unobstructed driveway, I take just a moment to enjoy the shade. The previous owners left everything behind except the light bulbs, and it took me 2 weeks to understand why. When my wife and I bought the old farmhouse, the real estate agent framed it as a gift. Move-in ready, she said, furniture included, they just want it gone. And it was true. The beds were made. There were plates in the cupboards, coats on the hooks, a half-finished puzzle on the dining table. But every single light fixture in the house was empty. Bare sockets, every one. We figured they'd taken the bulbs to save a few dollars, which was strange for people who left a leather couch behind. But we didn't dwell on it. We drove to the hardware store, bought a big box of bulbs, and started filling the sockets 1 room at a time. That's the first thing I want you to hold on to. We put them in ourselves. The kitchen light burned out in 2 days. I remember thinking that was fast, but bulbs die. I replaced it. It burned out again the next morning. Then the hallway one went. Then the porch. Within a week, I had gone through nearly the entire box, and I started keeping a little tally on the fridge, half as a joke, counting how many bulbs the house had eaten. My wife laughed about it. "Old wiring," she said. "We'll get an electrician." The electrician came. His name was Dale, an older guy who'd worked the whole county for 30 years. He tested everything. The wiring, he said, was fine, better than fine. Recently redone, in fact, all up to code. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking up at the fixture. And then he asked me a question I didn't expect. He asked how long we'd been keeping count. I told him about the tally on the fridge. He didn't laugh. He asked to see it, and he read the numbers slowly. The dates next to each one, and his face did something I didn't like. Then he asked me if the previous owners had left anything else behind. Any lists? Any notes? We hadn't found any. But that night I started looking properly, and inside the back cover of that half-finished puzzle box, folded into a tight square, I found a piece of paper. It was a tally, just like mine. Dates going back years, each one with a number, each one a burned-out bulb. But theirs didn't stop at a dozen like mine. Theirs went on for pages, hundreds of entries, and at the very bottom, in shaky handwriting, 3 words. It counts too. I want to be clear about how grounded I'm trying to keep this, because I've gone over it 1,000 times looking for the ordinary answer. Here is what we eventually pieced together. The house had a well pump on a very old, very sensitive electrical loop, and the pump kicked on with a surge every time the water pressure in the tank dropped past a certain point. That surge, tiny but constant, was what killed the bulbs. It was, in the end, completely explainable. But here's the part that still keeps me up. The pump only surged when someone used water. A flush toilet, a running tap, a filling glass. The bulbs died in proportion to how much the house was lived in. The more people moved through it, the more it consumed. The previous owners weren't counting bulbs. They were counting themselves. Every mark on that list was a day they'd used the house, and the house had used them back, a little at a time, until the tally got so long they simply stopped and walked away and left everything behind, hoping maybe if no one lived here, it would finally stop counting. We replaced the pump. The bulbs last for months now, but I never took the tally off the fridge, and I never added the last number. Because some nights when the house is quiet and I hear the pipes tick, I get the feeling it's still keeping count, whether I write it down or not. For 11 years, my grandfather called me every Sunday at noon, and the phone rang 3 days after his funeral. I nearly dropped my coffee. The screen said Grandpa Walt, that name I'd never had the heart to delete, and for one insane, hopeful second, my whole chest lit up before reality came crashing back down. He was gone. I'd carried the casket myself, but the phone was ringing, so I answered it, and I said hello in a voice that barely worked. It wasn't him, of course. It was a woman. She sounded about my age, maybe a little older, and she was crying too, and she said, "I'm so sorry, I know this is strange, but is this Walt's grandson? Is this the number he called every Sunday?" I said yes, and she said, "My name is Rosa, and I think I owe you an explanation. Here's what I knew about my grandfather. He was a retired postal worker, widowed, young, gruff, punctual to a fault. Every Sunday at noon, without fail, he called me. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes, near the end, when his mind was slipping, he'd just breathe on the line and tell me the same story about a snowstorm in 1962. I never missed the call. I built my Sundays around it. What I did not know was that my grandfather made a second call every Sunday, right after mine, to Rosa, and Rosa, it turned out, was a stranger. She explained it slowly, still crying. About 4 years earlier, she said, she'd been at the lowest point of her life, alone in a new city, and one night she'd been sitting on the floor of her apartment thinking about not being here anymore, and her phone rang. Wrong number. An old man's voice, warm and certain, saying, "Hey there, kiddo, sorry to bother you." He'd misdialed by a single digit. My number and hers were nearly identical. She said she doesn't know why she didn't just hang up. She was so far down she almost couldn't speak, but he could hear something in her silence. the way grandfathers can, and instead of apologizing and ending the call, he stayed on the line. He talked to her for 2 hours. He told her about the snowstorm in 1962. And before he hung up, he said, "I call my grandson every Sunday at noon. How about I call you right after, every week, just to check you're still here?" And he did. For 4 years, every Sunday, right after he hung up with me, my grandfather dialed one digit wrong on purpose and spent another hour keeping a stranger alive. He never told me. He never told anyone. Rosa said she got better. She said she got a job and a dog and a reason, and that every single week that old man asked her the same 3 questions. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you still here? The reason she was calling, she said, was that he hadn't called in 3 weeks, and she'd finally worked up the courage to dial the number herself, and she'd been terrified of exactly this. She just needed to know what happened to him. She needed to say thank you, and she was too late. I sat on my kitchen floor the same way she'd once sat on hers, and I told her everything. About the casket, about the snowstorm story I thought was only mine. And then, because I could hear that same silence in her that he must have heard 4 years ago, I heard myself say the thing before I'd even decided to. I said, "Rosa, I don't want to break the streak. How about I call you every Sunday, right after noon?" There was a long pause on the line, and then she laughed. This wet, broken, beautiful laugh, and she said that sounded like something he would say. That was 2 years ago. I've called her every single Sunday since. She's doing wonderfully, and every week when I hang up, I swear I can feel my grandfather somewhere, punctual as ever, nodding once and saying, "Good, kiddo, now you understand what the calls were really for." That's all for tonight, so let me know down in the comments which story was your favorite, and if you're still awake, well, there's always one more.